Every classic Universal monster is indebted to history to some degree, pulling from legends, novels, and real life to build creatures born out of the stories that scared us long before film. But it's the Mummy that is the most directly tied to ancient history, with Universal producer Carl Laemmle Jr. taking inspiration from the then recent opening of King Tutankhamun's tomb and the supposed Curse of the Pharaohs for a centuries-spanning creature born out of the past. And with ancient Egyptian history becoming popular in the Western world due to these excavations, Universal's first foray into the story of the Mummy in 1932 helped to quickly establish the studio as the destination for horror. But The Mummy would never reach the same heights in the genre as its contemporaries, due to its conflicting interpretations and low-budget returns. And yet The Mummy's iconic appearance and original story of romance and terror across time helped it to stand alongside Dracula, Frankenstein, the Wolfman, the Invisible Man, and the creature from the Black Lagoon as one of Universal's great creatures, going on to become the only one of the monsters whose defining film came in the form of a remake. This is the complete history of Universal's Mummy, spanning from its real-life ancient inspirations to its struggles in the classic era to two different interpretations that both temporarily revived and killed the Universal monsters in the modern day. Join me as we excavate Universal Pictures' most flawed creation. The 1920s saw a massive surge of interest in ancient Egyptian history and mythology due to a massive amount of archaeological digs happening in the country. And while excavations had been regularly happening since the discovery of the Rosetta Stone in 1799 during Napoleon's invasion of the country, the 20s sparked a renewed interest with several major findings. The most important of these was the discovery of Pharaoh Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 by Egyptologist Howard Carter. What made the Tutankhamun discovery so special was that, unlike many of the tombs found before, this one hadn't been compromised by grave robbers. Instead, the intact tomb had preserved history older than 3,000 years, and the unprecedented discovery not only sparked massive national pride in Egypt, but also created a media frenzy in America about who English speakers dubbed King Tut. The death of the dig sponsor, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, also began speculation into what people dubbed the Mummy's Curse, with anyone who disturbed the tomb of a pharaoh doomed to die a horrible death. Digs would continue across Egypt and the Middle East for decades to come, often marked by tension between governments and the foreign archaeologists who sought to bring their discoveries back home. For a while, the Western world's eyes were glued on Egypt, and so it was in this atmosphere of Egyptian obsession that Carl Laemmle Jr., at this point already in charge of Universal Pictures' horror output and finding massive success with the back-to-back productions of Dracula and Frankenstein, assigned writers Nina Wilcox Putnam and Richard Shayer to create a brand new story inspired by the supposed Mummy's Curse. The result? Not the Mummy. It was a short story named Cagliostro. Here, an ancient Egyptian priest has stayed alive for 4,000 years thanks to the wonders of nitrates, and has gone about killing any woman who resembles the person that betrayed him millennia ago, with the priest now in modern-day San Francisco. Laemmle very quickly announced plans to make Cagliostro starring Boris Karloff, now already famous for his work as Frankenstein's monster. But when screenwriter John L. Balderston turned the short story into an actual screenplay, it underwent massive changes, as its title changed to The King of the Dead, then Imhotep, and finally the much more obvious The Mummy. Directed by Karl Freund, who had served as cinematographer on Dracula, The Mummy sees Karloff as the ancient Egyptian high priest Imhotep, who was put to death and cursed for trying to resurrect his beloved Ankh-Senamun. But an excavation in the 1920s uncovers his sarcophagus and the Scroll of Thoth, with one of the explorers reading it aloud and accidentally awakening Imhotep, driving himself mad in the process.
He went for a little walk.
Jumping ahead 11 years, we meet archaeologist Frank Wemple, played by David Manners, and his love interest, Helen, played by Zita Johann, who meet Ardith Bey, in actuality a nattily-dressed Imhotep. The drama of it all comes from Imhotep's discovery that Ankh-Senamun's soul has been reincarnated as Helen, and now our monster wants to revive her consciousness and turn her into an immortal mummy like him. So there's a whole lot of Dracula in that plot. Not necessarily the Bram Stoker novel, but the structure and focus of the 1931 film, with Dracula coming to the modern world, hiding among the people trying to stop him as an aristocrat, and pulling his female victim into his world before he's stopped for good. Balderston also wrote the Dracula play the Universal picture was based on, so maybe the guy had a structure he trusted. Karloff makes for an excellent, seductive villain, blending horror and romance together in his portrayal of a man who has paid the ultimate price for his love and will do anything to get her back, no matter who must pay in turn. This is the other side of Karloff that playing Frankenstein's monster couldn't show. He's articulate, imposing, and able to create a haunting magnetism. Of all the original Universal monster movies, The Mummy is the most romantic, but it's propelled by a very dark romance, and Imhotep is one of the most outright villainous. He's punished by the gods for his sacrilege, but by the time we're in the modern day, there's nothing sympathetic about him, especially since his love for Ankh-Sanamun means he's willing to destroy Helen's soul and make his ancient love a victim in the process. Almost a century later, The Mummy is clearly a byproduct of its time. An American obsession with foreign culture and myth, but a lack of any actual Egyptian actors or creators involved. Real-life mythology that's just sorta mixed and matched to fit the story. Thankfully, it's really only Imhotep that fits the role of scary foreigner, and even then, he's one that the Egyptians would reject for his sacrilege. I will say that the original Mummy is also a lot slower and less elegantly structured than most of its contemporaries. Although it has some truly unforgettable shots and moments thanks to Freund and cinematographer Charles Stumar, alongside a $196,000 budget for great sets and cool outdoor scenes. And of course, as always, special attention must be paid to Jack Pierce's makeup for Karloff. While the Mummy is only seen briefly in his classic bandaged form at the start, it's an unforgettable image, with Karloff wrapped from head to toe in boiled linen bandages, smothered in clay and glued on cotton that took 10 hours to apply, with Pierce forgetting to give the actor a fly for peeing and forcing the actor to hold it all day. That was thankfully a short part of the shoot. As for Imhotep in the modern day, Pierce painstakingly gave all of Karloff's exposed skin an ancient, almost paper-like appearance by stretching out the skin, applying spirit gum, drying it, and releasing it to create wrinkles everywhere, applied inch by inch for each day of shooting. It's a much more subtle monster look than what was seen in the studio's other films, and overall, The Mummy is a much more subdued film. Its box office, likewise, was also lower than its contemporaries with $370,000. As such, there were no immediate plans for the sequel, unlike the smash hit of Frankenstein. When The Mummy did return, it would be in a very different form. A lot happened in the 8 years between The Mummy and The Mummy's Hand. As I previously covered in my Frankenstein retrospective, the full induction of the Hays Production Code in 1936 and its heavy censorship of anything taboo caused Universal to slam the brakes on their booming horror movies, until their proven box office success pushed the Lamleys to make more, starting with Son of Frankenstein and The Invisible Man Returns. Next up for revival was The Mummy, but instead of a direct sequel to what came before, The Mummy's Hand in 1940 is essentially a loose remake of the original. Now, it's the Egyptian prince Charis who is doomed to a cursed mummification over his love of Princess Ananka. But this is no longer a story of reincarnated love and loss. Instead, Charis, played here by Tom Tyler, who had come from Universal's westerns, remains a shambling, bandage-wrapped undead monster throughout this and the coming films. A tool used by the Egyptian high priest Andoheb to protect the tomb of Ananka from invading explorers led by Dick Foran as Steve Banning. Hand is much more focused on action and adventure than the original, lacking in the typical monstrous love that the first film used to help cement the Universal approach to horror, and instead filled with death as the victims of Charis slowly mount, each just kinda shook and strangled by the mummy's wrapped hands. Like the original, Banning must save his love interest, Marta, played by Peggy Moran, from the High Priest, shooting him dead and burning Charis to ashes. There are a few elements here that would define the Mummy movies to come. Tana leaves. There must always be a high priest that administers the Tana leaves to Charis to keep him in an undead state, and then give him more to bring him to life. Body count. Karras is raised each night to kill anyone seen as a threat to Ananka's grave, making this more about the thrills and less about the romance. And shrinking budgets. The Mummy's Hand was made for $80,000, when Son of Frankenstein just a year earlier was given a $420,000 budget. With no money to spend and an extremely tight 2-week schedule, Hand reuses footage from the original to depict Karras' past in ancient Egypt, reuses the sets from James Whale's Green Hell, only has Jack Pierce makeup for the mummy's close-ups and otherwise uses a rubber mask, and takes most of the score from Son of Frankenstein. Still, The Mummy's Hand is able to tell a big adventure that's more epic in scope and more focused on exploration and action than the 1932 original, becoming like the serials of the time instead of a dark romance. The tactic, while not loved by critics, worked well enough with audiences that Universal quickly jumped on making more. With this new iteration of The Mummy proving successful, Universal would quickly pump out 3 more, with The Mummy's Tomb in 1942, The Mummy's Ghost in 1944, and The Mummy's Curse, also in 1944. Alongside many Invisible Man pictures, and quite a few monster mashes, these fast and cheap mummy movies really illustrate the majority of Universal's strategy during World War II. Keep the budgets low and stick to the formula that brings in money. There's very, very little to differentiate these 3 from one another, or really from the previous Mummy's Hand. Take a look. In The Mummy's Tomb, we pick up 30 years after Hand, so it's technically 1970, with an older Steve Banning now living in Massachusetts and targeted by the still-alive High Priest, along with anyone else connected to their last adventure. With a now old Steve and returning comic relief Babe Hansen murdered, hey, better late than never, it's up to Banning's son John to stop the mummy's rampage across small-town America, and the new priest in control of him, Mehmet Bey, after Andoheb passes away from being tore up from the floor up. Karras is eventually destroyed in a pretty sick burning house finale. In The Mummy's Ghost, Andoheb is somehow still alive and teaches another priest, Yusuf Bey, to control Karras, still alive and once again terrorizing Massachusetts like a member of the Kennedy family. The twist this time is that Princess Ananka's body has been destroyed, as she's been reincarnated as Amina, love interest of Tom. Who is Tom? He's just Tom. Amina, under the trance of Bey, is taken by Karras, who kills the new priest and takes his reincarnated true love into a conveniently nearby swamp, with Amina aging into a mummy in a pretty dark, unconventional ending. And finally, in The Mummy's Curse, Karras and Amina are recovered from a swamp in Louisiana. That whole eastern seaboard swamp network is just so confusing. With Amina on the run from Karras, new high priest Zandab, and treacherous disciple Rageb, climaxing in our villains all dead, and Amina once again turned into a mummy. According to the time jumps, this would take place in 1995, and yet Gangsta's Paradise by Coolio is not on the soundtrack. Here, the mummy is played by Lon Chaney Jr., who became one of the pillars for Universal during the 40s, playing both the son of Dracula and Frankenstein's monster. But the mummy is easily his most forgettable role, not allowing him to really emote at all while masked, wrapped up, and unable to use one arm. It's a super recognizable look, but he's nothing more than a shambling henchman, with the films owing their dynamic to Son of Frankenstein, as our personality-free central monster does the dirty work for a human villain. As for Chaney himself, he reportedly hated the role, and kept a flask of vodka hidden in his bandages at all times to get through the days, saying, "I sleep but I can't wait for the way. I eat but I can't sweat." I think he was wrapped up when saying that. These 3 films really can't hide their B-movie nature, with each being only 60 minutes long, all of them largely taking place in the US to avoid the need to build complex Egyptian sets, frequently reusing footage from previous movies, and the plots being so formulaic that it's easy to mistake one for another. For a while, as Universal worked to keep their films flowing as World War II raged on, The Mummy helped the studio stay profitable, but never felt like more than a programmer in the studio's larger schedule. Premiering on December 22, 1944, The Mummy's Curse would be one of the last Universal monster movies, and our bandage-wrapped bringer of doom returned to his tomb until a certain comedic duo unearthed him once again more than a decade later. In 1948, Bud Abbott and Lou Costello had their film careers re-energized by Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. That film was a monster mash done in the style of the previous House of Dracula and Frankenstein movies, but with our two comedians at the center of the film, caught up in a multi-monster story played for laughs, but keeping the continuity and personalities of the monsters intact. With that film's success, the duo went on a huge run of movies, with a dozen more films in the next 7 years, including several Universal mashups, until landing us at Abbott and Costello Meet the Mummy in 1955. Here, the duo plays a pair of travelers who find themselves wrapped up in the search for a sacred medallion and the treasure it will reveal, with different sides including an Egyptian cult fighting to possess them. But don't expect this to be a continuation of Universal's Mummy series. Not only is our main mummy now named Clarice for whatever reason, but he doesn't show up until an hour into this hour 20 movie, now played by stuntman Ed Parker. It's essentially just using the Egyptian setting and aesthetics for gags that could take place anywhere, and with Abbott and Costello just going by their own names for the first time here, it feels like everyone involved was ready to move on. By 1955, 2 of the Creature from the Black Lagoon movies had already been made, marking the final addition to the Universal monster canon, and Abbott and Costello would only make one more movie together. The time for all of this had truly passed, and with Clarice destroyed once again, and the Mummy Temple turned into a nightclub, capitalism, am I right kids? This Universal monster had finally been laid to rest. Given that the Mummy uses Egyptian mythology and iconography, there's only a few things that Universal can actually copyright, such as the character of Imhotep or the very specific looks of its characters. Even then, these are using images of mummy digs in real-life history, so it's no surprise that there have been many mummy movies outside of Universal's work. In the 1950s, Mexican writer and director Rafael Portillo created the Aztec Mummy trilogy, all shot back to back to back and definitely using elements of Universal's films in its own mythology. And like many other Universal monsters, Hammer Film Productions gave The Mummy his second biggest franchise, with their own series of 4 films starring a variety of actors, but kicking off with Hammer stalwarts Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee, and a plot that's heavily indebted to Hand, Tomb, and Ghost, with its prophet using Chorus for revenge. But outside of the Disney Channel's Under Wraps movies, and the Bruce Campbell Elvis retirement home horror comedy Bubba Hotep, he sucks your soul out of your butt by the way, the Mummy mostly played supporting roles in monster mashes like Mad Monster Party, Waxwork, and of course, The Monster Squad. But given that these all take the route of the Mummy being a shambling, withered, undead corpse that does little more than attack, it's not all that surprising how uninteresting our Egyptian zombie is in most other movies. It would be 44 years after his last appearance at Universal that the Mummy would spring to life again in what has become his definitive movie. By the end of the 1980s, Universal was ready to return to The Mummy with a remake, putting producers Jim Jacks and Sean Daniel in charge with the goal of making a small-budget horror movie. Over the next decade, George Romero, Clive Barker, Mick Garris, Alan Ormsby, Joe Dante, and John Sayles were all brought on board, created new scripts, and left. Eventually, a script by Kevin Jarre sparked interest by director Stephen Sommers, who had recently made The Jungle Book and Deep Rising, and had always wanted to create a mummy movie of his own after being scared by the original as a kid. The combination of Sommers' pitch and the clear inability by Universal to get a mummy movie made on a small budget led to this new action-adventure focused approach costing $80 million to pull off its extensive CGI effects and massive sets, while having a much grander scope than anything the studio had tried with the property before. With a final script by Sommers, this version of The Mummy reveals the ancient story of Imhotep, played by Arnold Vosloo, a high priest who has an affair with Ankh-Sunamun, future bride of the pharaoh. And with Ankh-Sunamun taking her own life, Imhotep is mummified alive and cursed for trying to resurrect her. The rest of the movie takes place in 1926, as sibling Egyptologists Evie, played by Rachel Weisz, and Jonathan, played by John Hannah, team up with American treasure hunter and scoundrel Rick O'Connell, Brendan Fraser, to discover the legendary City of the Dead, Hamunaptra. Of course, our heroes, along with their treasure-hunting competitors, accidentally awaken the mummy of Imhotep, who now has incredible powers he'll use to take over the world. A lot of the ideas of this version of The Mummy are pulled from the Karloff original, but its structure, sense of adventure, and throwback style of action and heroism are clearly deeply indebted to Indiana Jones. And like Spielberg's films, Sommers' Mummy has a lot of great action set pieces, while also injecting horror and romance into its story. making it into a broadly targeted, crowd-pleasing adventure that's also not afraid to scare its audience and have some genuinely dark moments. Flesh-eating scarabs, plucking out eyeballs, ritual sacrifice. It's all here, just edited enough to maintain a PG-13 rating. A lot of that is balanced out by the sheer charisma and likability of its characters, with Fraser, Weiss, and company having great chemistry, and able to pull off a lot of cheesy one-liners that would probably feel clunky when said by anyone else. This might be the hottest cast in film history. Nothing but babes of all genders as far as the eye can see. As for the mummy himself, Imhotep is slowly reconstructed during the first half of the film, going from a dried husk to a complete body as he sucks the life and flesh from his cursed victims. It's a very effective horror-focused approach that these films had never done before, and with massive powers that evoke Egypt's history in the Old Testament with the 10 plagues, Imhotep feels like a massive threat, while he's still propelled by a dark love, which is helped by his normal human appearance. Here, Evie isn't necessarily the object of Imhotep's affections, but the means for his reincarnation of Ankh-Sunamun, with Rick becoming a selfless hero in the process of their romance. There's also little bastard Benny and greedy Jonathan to add different degrees of morality to the cast, as we blaze through massive set pieces that still look really incredible 25 years later. There's something about this movie that doesn't just evoke classic monsters and indie, but even earlier swashbucklers like Errol Flynn's Robin Hood, with a more modern approach to character and comedy. Summers revealed, when we previewed the movie, a couple of studio executives were like, "People aren't cheering when Brendan kills the mummy. Maybe the fight needs to be longer." I go, no guys, they're never gonna cheer. They're happy that Brendan saved Rachel, and all three of them work together to kill the mummy, and they're glad the mummy's dead, but at the same time, they kind of understand his motivations. I guess it gives it dimensions. They're not just pure evil. Most good actors would not want to do something that's one-dimensional pure evil. Universal's gamble on having Summers turn their decades-old property into a period-piece adventure paid off. The Mummy made $417 million and was one of the biggest films of 1999. And just like Imhotep promises as he fades away, his death was only the beginning.
Universal Pictures presents Brendan Fraser, Rachel Weisz, John Hannah, Arnold Vosloo, Odette Fair, Patricia Velasquez, introducing Freddie Both, and The Rock as the Scorpion King.
In 2001, The Mummy did indeed return with The Mummy Returns. In it, The Mummy returned. With Summers back as writer and director, Returns is doing the first movie again but bigger. Here, Imhotep is resurrected by his loyal followers and the modern resurrection of Ankh-Sunamun, while Rick and Evie are now crazy rich, married, and have a little jabroni for a son named Alex. Also, Evie and Rick are reincarnations. She of Nefertiti, the pharaoh's daughter. She was just slightly off-screen the whole time, and he a random Medjai warrior we never see. It's okay guys, the tattoo isn't cultural appropriation. He's 1/15th Egyptian. And so our familiar friends and enemies reunite in the quest for the Pyramid of the Scorpion King, an ancient warlord given power by Anubis and played by Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson in his first film role. Returns is pretty fun, but it's a real downgrade compared to Summers' first movie. Right from the start, it's obvious that this movie is trying to recapture the magic of the first, but make everything bigger and crazier. Mummy fights on a speeding bus, a hot air balloon chased by a water face, a gigantic jungle populated by pygmy mummies, 2 magic bad guys for the price of 1, and a massive Phantom Menace showdown that's both a triple threat match and a battle against the huge Anubis army. The downside is that Returns didn't have the budget or timeline it needed to pull off this supersized approach. If I could describe VFX work in the early 2000s in one word, it would be hubristic. People thought CGI could do everything, and it couldn't. There are so many instances of poorly rendered CGI locations, vehicles, and characters all suffering from an overcommitment from the team and a lack of time. But worst of all, and easily the thing Returns is best known for, is the reveal of The Rock in his final monstrous Scorpion King form. With not enough time and not the right photographic references, everything about this character is hilariously terrible. The dramatic introduction only to result in the true reveal is like a waiter at a fancy restaurant theatrically unveiling a steaming turd. The PS2 skin textures, the awkward movements, the Fortnite eyebrow, it all combines to make a climax that deflates what was already a somewhat underwhelming movie. Still, Returns performed well, making $435 million against its bigger budget of $98 million. But the relative success of Returns didn't result in another sequel right away. Instead, the path splits into 3 avenues. First is The Mummy the Animated Series, which premiered in 2001 on Kids WB and lasted 2 seasons for a total of 26 episodes. The show takes the general setup of the movies, the O'Connell family, Imhotep, the Magi, and packages it in a kid-friendly approach like what was previously done with Men in Black or Godzilla. Next is the prequel spin-off The Scorpion King in 2002, bringing back The Rock in his fully human form and as a hero, instead of the slaughter-happy ruler that eventually gets his dick replaced by a scorpion tail, but like not in a cool way. The movie did fine at the box office and is essentially Conan the Barbarian, with 4 more Scorpion King movies going straight to video with different actors in the lead role, somehow lasting until 2018. And finally, Van Helsing, which seems to pop up in every one of these videos, directed by Summers. Van Helsing doesn't have anything to do with the Mummy movies, but it's very much done in the style of them, with Hugh Jackman hunting an assortment of creatures. And while I think Van Helsing is really fun schlock, I would have much rather seen a Mummy sequel keep Rick, Evie, and the gang, and pit them against these monsters one by one to keep the series going. Van Helsing's underperformance delayed any further Mummy plans for years, and by the time the Mummy returned, again, things would be very different.
Good going, Dad. He raised another mummy. In his tomb, said he had control of the 5 elements.
I hate mummies! They never play fair!
The Mummy, Tomb of the Dragon Emperor from 2008, brings back our heroes, mostly, and pits them against Jet Li as Han the Dragon Emperor, conveniently mummified and turned into a terracotta warrior by Michelle Yeoh's Sorceress. Cue kinda the same thing again, but now in China. As a movie, Dragon Emperor is trying to have it both ways. We can't do Imhotep again as Returns really proved that well was dry, but we also can't change it too much. This is an O'Connell Mummy movie after all. So by having this be a Chinese mummy now, complete with terracotta warriors, the Great Wall, a dragon, and yetis, they can do both. Fraser is doing his best here, but years later, the actor revealed that all the stunt work he had done for these movies had massively screwed up his body, forcing him to wear ice packs, tape, bike pads, and more under his costume to keep his body together while filming. Afterward, Fraser underwent multiple knee, back, and spine surgeries for his massive injuries. Fraser's physical work on these movies is incredible, but all those shots of him getting thrown straight into hard ground and walls probably wasn't worth it. This is why stunt teams exist. In contrast, Jet Li, famous for his incredible martial arts choreography, is a CGI statue most of the time, while Maria Bello takes over as Evie in an incredibly distracting recast, after Vice declined to return due to problems with the script. Yeah, that's putting it lightly. Luke Ford is also here as the now adult jabroni, Alex, complete with his own romance and arc and taking up at least 2 hours too much of screen time. And as far as Cohen goes, his style of directing matches the monster. Technically lifeless. While Dragon Emperor premiered only 9 years after the first of these new movies, it feels like forever since the O'Connells were last on screen. And in that near decade, the film industry had massively changed. By 2008, the twin releases of The Dark Knight and Iron Man fully established superhero movies as the de facto blockbuster focus, while the Universal monsters were not in the zeitgeist whatsoever. Dragon Emperor would make $403 million. Not bad at all, but when you consider this is less than the previous 2, even before taking inflation into consideration, then remember this movie cost $145 million to make, you can see why this was the end for this incarnation of The Mummy. Add in the fact that 2004's Van Helsing was also a disappointment, and you can see Universal back away from their monsters on screen for almost a decade. Their return would be one of the studio's most embarrassing misfires.
Welcome to a new world of gods and monsters.
After all these retrospectives, I finally get to officially talk about the specter that's haunted the Universal monsters in recent years: the Dark Universe. In 2014, Universal announced that Alex Kurtzman and Chris Morgan would be spearheading the Dark Universe, the studio's own cinematic universe with new versions of its classic monsters. And while Dracula Untold from 2014 was tweaked in post-production to tease future movies, that plan was abandoned for the true start to happen with 2017's The Mummy. Written by David Koepp, Christopher McQuarrie, and Dylan Kussman, and directed by Alex Kurtzman, The Mummy is way more interesting to talk about than to watch. And its goals and fallout are what most people remember instead of what actually happened in the movie. But let's give a brief rundown of the what before we get to the why. This newest version of The Mummy stars Tom Cruise as Nick Morton, a U.S. sergeant and adventurer who unearths the tomb of ancient evil mummy Princess Amenet, played by Sofia Boutella, in present-day Iraq. From there, we get a very similar plot to The Summers Mummy, as our leads must stop her from destroying the world with her big sand powers. Of course, what differentiates this movie is its ambitions to launch the Dark Universe, with a now infamous picture released to the media prior to The Mummy's debut, featuring the many stars of its upcoming new interpretations of classic monsters. Frankenstein, The Invisible Man, and more were all intended to be given their own interconnected movies, with a focus on action-adventure instead of horror. It's pretty obvious that Universal simply saw the heyday of the Marvel Cinematic Universe and wanted their own slice of the pie. By the end, Princess Amunet is killed by Tom Cruise kissing her. That wasn't in the script, it was just an unfortunate on-set incident, and the world is saved like a typical superhero movie. Kurtzman's Mummy makes its cinematic universe aspirations very clear. Not only does Cruise's character get full-on mummy powers by the end, you know he's a mummy because his hands are wrapped in bandages, ooh spooky, but we also encounter the secret society Prodigium, run by Russell Crowe as Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde if you nasty, which studies and destroys monsters. Cue a second act trip to their headquarters, some very obvious Easter eggs, Crowe, 2 years younger than Cruise, telling the then 54-year-old actor,
"You are a younger man, but you'd best learn to be wary of a man like me."
And the end, setting Cruise's neo-mummy character to essentially be the Iron Man of this new universe. After hearing all that, it shouldn't be too surprising to learn that Cruise was contractually guaranteed control of the movie, taking it from the mostly unproven director Kurtzman and turning it into a vehicle like his Mission Impossible movies, by hiring frequent collaborator Christopher McQuarrie and a few others to rewrite the script and taking over editing. Is The Mummy better or worse because of Cruise's takeover? I can't say for sure, but with all those hopes, ambitions, and vanity battles in place, The Mummy would go on to make $409 million worldwide against its $195 million budget. With the cost of marketing added in, box office percentages paid out to Cruise, and the extra cost of investment into Dark Universe plans taken into account, The Mummy actually lost money for Universal. And so, the Dark Universe was officially dead, just a few months after The Mummy's premiere. Well, dead on screen. Universal is now embracing smaller budget remakes with a focus on horror, but the Dark Universe as a brand has recently been given new life as a land at the Universal Orlando Resort. At the time of this video, it isn't open yet, but its focus on gothic, European-influenced horror is way cooler to me than this pseudo-Avengers half-measure. But despite so many monsters featured in the rides and experiences, you know who's missing? The Mummy. After so many reincarnations, he's dead. And as I do with every retrospective, here's every Mummy movie ranked. Number 10, The Mummy from 2017. While some higher entries on this list are more shoddily made, this is like the embodiment of everything broken in modern franchise filmmaking. The story is ass. It rips off so much of the Summers movies without having their quality. It's all in service to Cruise's ego. The action is bland. Most of it takes place in ugly, poorly lit catacombs. It jams in universe building over and over. It doesn't commit to any decisions to keep its sequel options open. And the scariest thing about this horror franchise continuation is the amount of industry jobs it costs because this turkey bombed so hard. This latest, and probably last for quite a while, version of The Mummy is barely even trying to be a horror movie. Thankfully, its poor performance kept the studio from pursuing the Dark Universe any further. Number 9, The Mummy's Curse. The final entry in the original line of films, Curse has nothing new to say about its subject despite coming right after some fresh new ideas were brought to the series. This isn't terrible or anything, but the plot rehashing, reused footage, and repetitive structure is just so worn out by this point with nothing new added. We're also completely out of any Egypt-related locations in favor of just an everyday US setting. These late sequels, and Curse's status as the end of the original line, really put the original Mummy franchise at the bottom of the classic Universal Monsters ranking. Number 8, Abbott and Costello Meet the Mummy. I wish I liked this anywhere near as much as Meets Frankenstein, but unfortunately, this can barely be bothered to use its monster. Meet the Mummy is fine, but it could really be any plot or setting because it's just a series of bits that could be done anywhere. The Mummy in question doesn't even come to life until almost an hour in, and I think this is fairly anonymous besides a little bit of mummy stuff at the very end. Everyone involved was ready for this era to be done. Number 7, The Mummy, Tomb of the Dragon Emperor. With a general sense of this trying to refresh the series but not able to do anything new, this is a pretty poor continuation. There's something about this that feels so tired and off. Where's the sense of adventure? where's the horror? The first Fraser mummy is this perfect blend of everything, and I know that's hard to replicate, but this one demonstrates that maybe it was just impossible to get right again. Having Jet Li be a CGI character for most of this is a crime, and everything with Rick and Evie's son is terrible. Number 6. The Mummy's Tomb. This is where the original series really shifts into B-movie mode, with 10 whole minutes of this 60-minute movie devoted to recapping the mummy's hand with a clip show, and the film structured around Karis attacking the next in his long line of victims. It's doing nothing new, and its American setting is lacking the previous film's sense of adventure, which I think is important for these movies to really work. But it's a solid piece of entertainment, and I like the giant burning house finale, which has great practical effects and a real sense of danger. Number 5. The Mummy Returns. There's something that just doesn't work about this movie. The jokes don't land, the action is bland, the characters aren't interesting anymore, the romance is whatever, but it's also trying super hard to top everything in the first one, often by doing the same thing again but way bigger. Of course, the CGI is dog shit too, both for its time and after decades of advancement, but that's more highlighting how much this movie overextends itself. Still, it's entertaining and never boring, but I wish they had went in a very different direction for a sequel, because all the Mummy lore is totally tapped out already. Number 4. The Mummy's Ghost. Sticking to the same formula as the last two Mummy movies, Ghost is solid, cheesy entertainment, but it shows how Universal had very little ambition with most of its monsters during the 40s. Having Amina be the reincarnation of Ananka finally moves this recurring plot into a new direction, and creates a tragic romance that ties the film together much better. Its pretty dark and brutal ending makes a stronger, more memorable entry in these sequels. Number 3. The Mummy's Hand. A solid, sorta remake of the Karloff original, refit to the style of Universal in the 40s. It's a lot more adventurous, and our mummy, Karis here, is a straight-up monster and tool of the big villain in the style of Son of Frankenstein. That means he's less interesting than Imhotep, but we get a lot more cool mummy makeup. And with its setting largely in Egypt and tomb exploration a major part of its plot, Mummy's Hand is much more in line with what most people think of when it comes to this monster. The comic relief here is pretty terrible. Number 2. The Mummy from 1932. It's a classic for a reason, thanks to its performance by Karloff, some fantastic Pierce makeup, and the way it blends romance and horror way more than most of its fellow monsters. And while I love the ideas and the whole dark Egyptian mythology and romance that's explored here, I think the actual story and pacing leave a lot to be desired. Honestly, watching and rewatching these films has shown me that the Mummy franchise is just, as a whole, way weaker than Universal's other monster franchises. And at number 1, The Mummy from 1999. This is what God meant when he invented movies. As a kid, I was absolutely obsessed with this film, but thankfully, several rewatches in recent years cemented this as a movie I love even without nostalgia. It's filled with great performances, set pieces, and moments of horror, but what makes Sommer's first film so fantastic is that it's able to maintain a perfect balance of horror, action, comedy, and romance from start to finish. This is the fulfillment of the franchise's potential, but it's something that decades of film have shown to be almost impossible to achieve. Although Universal's Mummy franchise has been marked by more lows than highs, it's proven to be as immortal as its central monster, returning again and again, with the hope that its unmistakable blend of action, adventure, and horror will speak to another generation, further and further removed from the times that inspired it. And while it seems as though the Mummy has entered a deeper and darker slumber than ever before, there's no doubt this tomb will one day open once again. Thanks for watching today's video, and there's no better time to return to the Universal Monsters retrospective than the Halloween season. As you might already know if you've been following the channel, I've been doing Universal Monster retrospectives off and on for the last year and a half, as I've already covered Creature from the Black Lagoon, The Wolfman, and Frankenstein. So it was definitely time to talk about another, and I thought now was the perfect time to talk about The Mummy. As you can see from my video, The Mummy has a really interesting, complex history on screen, with a lot of lows and a few highs. But to me, The Mummy is overall the weakest of the Universal Monster series. Obviously, I absolutely adore the 1999 Stephen Sommers Mummy. It was one of my favorite movies as a kid, and it, alongside the original Men in Black and Mask of Zorro, were some of the live-action movies that I was absolutely obsessed with when I was growing up. And thankfully, I've gone back to all three of those movies and still think they are absolutely awesome, nostalgia be damned. The rest of these movies, however, have a lot of highs and lows. The original Mummy is a classic, but I wouldn't put it on the same level as Frankenstein or Bride of Frankenstein or The Wolfman or the original Invisible Man, or Creature from the Black Lagoon. And many of the ones that come after are just not very good. And of course, there's the Tom Cruise Dark Universe Mummy, which will always be a fascinating disaster to me. Although I am really looking forward to that Dark Universe theme park in Universal Orlando. If anyone can get me passes to that for its grand opening, please help. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the Universal Mummy movies, as well as what your own favorite interpretation of the Mummy is, and which classic monster you'd like to see me cover next in one of these retrospectives. We still have The Invisible Man and Dracula to go, and Phantom of the Opera would be given a sort of different treatment, as there's only a couple Universal movies and the rest of the Phantom's time on screen, and the stage, takes place outside of that studio. As always, a huge thank you to my patrons for their continued support. And if you'd like to be a patron, it's only $1 a month for early access to every video, and exclusive Patreon-only reviews, with weekly polls and exclusive reviews going up every week during October for the Halloween season. So until next time, I hope that you're taking care of yourselves and having a happy Halloween.